I've generally tried to avoid the media storm because it's just so toxic. It's counterproductive, and it just weighs upon my soul to follow it most of the time. But, you know, the stuff with the Twitter files that has come out, the things Matt Taibbi has reported are astonishing because they're things that we already knew. And I'm sure many of you already knew. We've seen them happening. We've seen the numbers on our own channels. We've seen the various clever ways of suppressing messages. We've seen channels deleted, but also just kept under wraps, hidden from their own followers and subscribers. That's what we've experienced. And I'm not even sure who's hearing this video, but it isn't everyone who subscribed to our channel. I don't know if it's anyone who didn't. I don't know. But it is incredible to see evidence come out showing the way that this censorship and suppression and algorithmic distortion has taken place, how it's been done consciously.
The original promise of the internet was that it might democratize the exchange of information globally. A free internet would overwhelm all attempts to control information flow, its very existence a threat to anti-democratic forms of government everywhere. What we found in the files was a sweeping effort to reverse that promise and use machine learning and other tools to turn the internet into an instrument of censorship and social control. Unfortunately, our own government appears to be playing a lead role.
You know, under the pretext that the narrative surrounding the big crisis that happened is more important than the facts, that the crisis that happened in the last couple of years and the narrative surrounding it is more important than the actual truth, and anything that falls by the wayside is just collateral damage and not important somehow.
This is a false narrative. We're engaging in false narratives here.
I mean, I guess there's just people who probably already understand this, and other people that I've talked to here and there and come across who wouldn't recognize the truth if it smacked them in the face because they've been so taken in by this narrative in particular and various narratives in general. I don't think I need to specify what narrative I'm talking about. But it's just, when I did first see this a few days ago and reacted to it, it just floored me that this could come out the way it does and that there aren't greater repercussions. You've got private organizations centered around major universities, major media outlets, working deliberately to prop up a narrative at the expense of the facts and the truth. There's just no other way to put it. Collaborating with government agencies in what would surely be interpreted as a very clear violation of the First Amendment.
We learned Twitter, Facebook, Google, and other companies developed a formal system for taking in moderation requests from every corner of government, from the FBI, the DHS, the HHS, DOD, the Global Engagement Center at State, even the CIA. For every government agency scanning Twitter, there were perhaps 20 quasi-private entities doing the same thing, including Stanford's Election Integrity Partnership, NewsGuard, the Global Disinformation Index, and many others, many taxpayer-funded.
In your testimony describing the cooperation between the federal government and tech companies like Twitter, you stated, quote, "A focus of this growing network is making lists of people whose opinions, beliefs, associations, or sympathies are deemed to be misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation," end quote. What's interesting to me is that what is missing from that list is the word unlawful.
That's true, yes.
And so it notably seems to be missing from the FBI's lexicon.
It is bad enough. I think it's already been a First Amendment violation for private companies to create a public forum, a quasi-public platform, albeit privately owned, for people to have their own channels to express themselves and then have those be censored and suppressed and crimped in. I think that is a violation, and the understanding of those platforms as public commons probably needs to be addressed directly. But when you get to the point where government agencies, whether on behalf of this agency or that agency, whether the White House or an intelligence agency or some claim of national security or some claim of public health, when a government agency goes to a private platform and directly has someone's post be removed, censored, algorithmically suppressed, counterbalanced with another narrative, or any of these other things that have been going on, that is a direct violation of the First Amendment.
There was a lack of capability around election disinformation. This is not because CISA didn't care about disinformation, but at the time, they lacked both kind of the funding and the legal authorizations to go do the kinds of work that would be necessary to truly understand how election disinformation was operating. So because of the feedback and the ideas from this group, we were able to pull together pretty quickly a project between these 4 different institutions to try to fill the gap of the things that the government could not do themselves. A project between these 4 different institutions to try to fill the gap of the things that the government could not do themselves.
It raises serious First Amendment questions. It is axiomatic that the government cannot do indirectly what it is prohibited from doing directly.
For a government agency to go censor speech anywhere through a private platform, to have any kind of direct outlet for that, is clearly a violation of free speech. Of course, it's not a direct mandate from the executive branch or a law created in Congress saying you will no longer be able to speak.
It sounds like the objective of the board is to prevent disinformation and misinformation from traveling around the country in a range of communities. I'm not sure who opposes that effort.
Nina Jankowicz, the head of the Disinformation Governance Board at the Department of Homeland Security, has resigned. This comes after Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas paused the program just 3 weeks after it was announced, amid criticism from Republicans.
But it is using the tools to take down speech through a government agency. That's a violation of the First Amendment, and it's very clear it would be interpreted that way if it went to the highest courts, and at some point, I'm sure it needs to. Meanwhile, there's been a bunch of denial and spin around the little bit that has come out and been processed and presented publicly through the Twitter files, and in this case, particularly with the reporting of Matt Taibbi.
Would you care to respond to the attack on your ethics? You weren't given really an opportunity to answer.
This is a grave threat to people of all political persuasions. The First Amendment and an American population accustomed to the right to speak is the best defense left against the censorship industrial complex. Ordinary Americans are not just being reported to Twitter for de-amplification or deplatforming, but to firms like PayPal, digital advertisers like Xandr, and crowdfunding sites like GoFundMe. As someone who grew up a traditional ACLU liberal, this mechanism for punishment and deprivation without due process is horrifying.
It's really shouldn't have anything to do with his personality or his political stance or what he's trying to accomplish. The truth should be the truth, and it should speak for itself, and everything else should yield to the fact that the truth is the truth. This idea of bending the spoon around the idea of the thing that you want to project, that you want the public to perceive, it's just a really disturbing precedent. This fight isn't over. It's going to be on many fronts, but the people are losing badly. You know, we had videos taken down here in the last couple of years. We had a lot of videos taken down just without question. And anytime we tried to challenge them and say, this isn't breaking the policies of this platform, why is this video being removed? They've just basically ignored it and upheld the takedown. We had a lot of videos taken down, especially if they had anything to do with one particular emergency narrative. And at least one of those videos was just simply a mainstream media report and our short reaction to it.
Thus, for 3 years, American troops were injected with a cold-preventing vaccine.
No, no, no! You can't do that! You look like you could be a threat.
If you know what's good for you, you'll run for your lives now.
And that was taken down, not for violating copyright or any kind of crap like that, but because it was an inconvenient truth.
The federal government wasn't doing a good enough job of informing the public about ineffective
No, don't be so stupid.
It is true that that report occurred, and it gave cause for alarm, for pause. It gave reason to consider aspects other than the narrative they wanted to promote, and yet it was decades old.
It's just not possible to instantly arrive at truth. It is, however, possible, becoming technologically possible to instantly define and enforce a political consensus online, which I believe is what we're looking at. Effectively, news media became an arm of a state-sponsored thought policing system.
But, that's what you find with this post, that if something could fuel hesitancy, even if it was true, it was going to be censored, banned, hidden from people.
But instead of investigating these groups, journalists partnered with them. If Twitter declined to remove an account right away, government agencies and NGOs would call reporters for the New York Times, Washington Post, and other outlets, who in turn would call Twitter demanding to know why action had not yet been taken. Effectively, news media became an arm of a state-sponsored thought policing system.
I don't know any reason why someone would want a population that just believed what they were told. That is to say, I don't know any good reason that someone would want the population to just believe what they're told. Why would you not want thinking people in this society? But they've given every indication that they don't want that. There have been headlines recently, several of them, that in effect say, don't do your research. Don't go down the rabbit hole. Don't try to think for yourself. You might get yourself confused. And it's just adding to the problem for people to try to do their own research because they're not qualified. Just remember, trust the experts, nothing to see here, even when people's lives are at stake, even when what you put in your body should be your own informed choice, certainly ideally, I can't believe the stuff that's been going on. Matt Taibbi, in some of his recent testimony in front of Congress, that he got a lot of flack for and a lot of partisan bickering. I don't see how this is a partisan issue, frankly.
You're asking a journalist to reveal a source.
So then you consider Mr. Musk to be the direct source of all this?
No, now you're trying to get me to say that he is the source. I just can't answer your question.
Well, he isn't. If you're telling me you can't answer because it's your source, well, then the only logical conclusion is that he is, in fact, your source.
Well, you're free to conclude that.
Well, sir, I just don't understand. You can't have it both ways, but let's move on because
no, he can. He's a journalist.
No, he can't, because either Musk is the source and he can't talk about it, or Musk is not the source. And if Musk is not the source, then he can discuss.
No one has yielded. The gentlelady's out of order. You don't get to speak.
She's out of order because he's interrupted.
The gentlelady's not recognized.
You're not recognized.
He has not said that. What he has said is he's not going to reveal his source, and the fact that Democrats are pressuring him to do so is such a
violation. We're asking him about his conversations with Musk.
The gentlelady has not yielded.
But the truth is, we want to focus on protecting the First Amendment. Mr. Schellenberger, are you a Republican?
No, I'm not.
You got any pro-Trump bumper stickers on your car?
I voted for Biden.
Voted for Biden. You know how many MAGA hats laying around your house, right?
I do not.
Yeah, but you said earlier, both you and Mr. Taibbi said this is the most chilling thing you've ever seen as journalists. Mr. Taibbi, the same thing. You're not a Republican either, right?
No, I'm not.
In your background, you're both good liberals, and you come in, and the Democrats' hostility to what you've undertaken is astonishing to behold, but it's part of the picture we're seeing.
In some ways, what you just said undermines the premise of this select committee, which is that the federal government has been organized to weaponize against conservative voices. And of course, what you've just indicated in your testimony is, well, actually, that's not the evidence you found.
No, I think this committee, my understanding is that they're concerned about the weaponization of the government against free speech, which is certainly what we're finding.
I thank you. My time has expired, but I appreciate your understanding of our committee. I have a different understanding. I yield back.
Well, you got the wrong understanding.
Matt Taibbi talked explicitly about censoring stories of true vaccine side effects and other stories they felt encouraged so-called hesitancy. And he talked about these posts he examined, the documents that came out, that they used the word true or truth multiple times. And yet they were explicitly targeting this content for censorship.
A focus of this fast-growing network, as Mike noted, is making lists of people whose opinions, beliefs, associations, or sympathies are deemed misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation. That last term is just a euphemism for true but inconvenient. Undeniably, the making of such lists is a form of digital McCarthyism.
And as Matt Taibbi commented, there are people who believe ordinary people can't handle difficult truths. The complexity, the nuance, they're just not able to, and so they just shouldn't, and so they can't, and so everyone can't. It's just ridiculous on its face. It's a very despotic and tyrannical indicator whatever this governance of private-public partnerships is, whatever the importance of the big narrative is or supposedly is, the idea that ordinary people can't handle the truth so they're not allowed to even try, and that their feelings about complex issues somehow don't matter and therefore their voices can't be heard. It is frighteningly absurd. It is right out of any of these dystopic novels or movies that I'm sure you've all seen over the years. You want a few examples? There they are. What's been going on, it's very similar to the card stacking fallacy, where you just present the information that supports your case, the cherry picking, except that it doubles down by encompassing the power to shut out all contrary information. Whether it's true or false or in between, they're not even going to have the debate. They're not going to encounter any resistance to their narrative. They're just only going to present the things that support their narrative and promote what they want to promote, and everything else can and will be removed from view, removed from platforms, censored, penalized, monetary penalties, any and all of it. It's crazy that this has been going on outside of the official policies of social media platforms, outside of the legal protections for free speech in this country, as so much, nearly all really, of free speech has moved online. You know, those who have the power to determine what you see online, all of you, have a great deal of power, quite obviously. I mean, sure, they still print some newspapers, and technically you can walk around town and talk to people one by one or hand them out a flyer or something. But I think it's pretty clear that when it comes to political issues in particular and ideas in general, most of the influence is happening in online encounters. People are going online primarily to social media, primarily to Google and other search engines to find the ideas that are going to form their opinions and whether or not they reinforce the prevailing attitudes, the official narratives. So if you hide everything that's contrary to that, that is pretty demoralizing. That it's just really sets up for the worst conditions. It's about as Orwellian of a thing that I have ever seen. And there's been quite a bit of Orwellian material to work through. I just almost don't have words for it. So
Now we know. Now we all know why. You guys said at the outset, this is the most chilling story. And you guys are New York Times bestsellers, award-winning journalists. But in all your time in the journalism field, this issue, most important. And how this, I think, what'd you call it, Mr. Schellenberg, this complex, what'd you call it? The
censorship industrial complex.
Totally, this web of censorship, big government, big tech, NGOs, all this web of censorship that Mr. Bishop was getting into in his line of questioning. That's what this committee is going to get to. And that's not right or left. This is just right or wrong. This is wrong. We know it's wrong, and it's about protecting the First Amendment.
Twitter and Stanford in particular were accused of running a disinformation campaign to hide the truth about a topic no one's allowed to even talk about.
The Virality Project also flagged reports of people contracting COVID after getting vaccinated, true vaccine side effects, and, quote, worrisome jokes. The hall monitors at the Virality Project described all of these instances as disinformation events. The project explicitly targeted, quote, true content which might promote vaccine hesitancy.
But Matt Taibbi said, we found a tweet from the Virality Project at Stanford, which is partnered with a number of government agencies and with Twitter itself and a number of other private companies, where they talked explicitly about censoring of true vaccine side effects and other true stories they felt encouraged hesitancy. They believe that ordinary people can't handle difficult truths, so they think they need minders to separate out things that are controversial and difficult for them.
The Stanford Internet Observatory, the University of Washington, the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, and Graphica have all inadequately disclosed ties to the Department of Defense, the CIA, and other intelligence agencies. They work with multiple U.S. government agencies to institutionalize censorship research and advocacy within dozens of other universities. If government officials are directing or facilitating such censorship, Notes one law professor, it raises serious First Amendment questions. It is axiomatic that the government cannot do indirectly what it is prohibited from doing directly. Moreover, we know that the US government has funded organizations that pressure advertisers to boycott news media organizations and social media platforms that refuse to censor and/or spread disinformation, including alleged conspiracy theories.
His partner in the testimony, Michael Schellenberger, said this is very disturbing because what they're doing is putting labels on the tweets, and in doing so, they're also trying to discredit you. It's another form of censorship on top of the censorship that's part of the larger disinformation campaign.
It is important to understand how these groups function. They are not publicly engaging with their opponents in an open exchange of ideas. They aren't asking for a national debate over the limits of the First Amendment. Rather, they are creating blacklists of disfavored people and then pressuring, cajoling, and demanding that social media platforms censor, de-amplify, and even ban the people on those lists. They've been building out basically mechanisms to proliferate a censorship industrial complex around the country to censor on a whole range of issues. And so you've seen this censorship industry go from, well, we're just fighting ISIS, to, well, we're just fighting Russian disinformation bots, to, well, now we need to fight domestic misinformation, which is just saying we need to fight against people who are saying things we disagree with online. That's all that means. And I mean, it's not a slippery slope. It's an immediate leap into a terrifying mechanism that we only see in totalitarian societies of attempting to gain control over what the social media platforms are allowing.
And again, I don't really care what you think of Matt Taibbi's reporting, support, don't support, somewhere in the middle. The point is, how can any organization wield this kind of influence and do what they're doing and not be stopped and claim it's for the greater good? Just because there was an emergency and a special narrative behind that emergency did not mean that we lost our rights. We didn't lose our right to speak. We didn't lose the right to choose what is right for our own individual person. We didn't lose the right to organize. We didn't lose the right to have religious and conscientious objection. And yet, it sure seemed that's how everybody was behaving. Man, will society ever recover from this? And really, more importantly, what was that period being used for? What are they going to do next with it?
3 years ago, if you thought it came from a lab, if you raised that, you were called a nut job. You got censored on Twitter. You were blacklisted on Twitter. And Dr. Fauci had to prove, no, he can't have that news getting out.
Dr. Fauci and his cohorts seemingly were running their own misinformation and ultimately censorship campaign. To, in quotes from Dr. Collins to Dr. Fauci, put down this very destructive conspiracy about the lab leak theory, even though privately they told each other that COVID-19 looked engineered and discussed the reason to stop the theory, that it would do great potential harm to science and international harmony and do unnecessary harm to science in general.
But here's the question I keep coming up with. If it may have been a lab, may have been nature, we're supposed to look forward, then why did Dr. Fauci work so hard for just one of those theories? What was Dr. Fauci doing? He was trying to cover his backside, and everybody knows, getting all kinds of money to tell us things that were not accurate, because we now know
of any evidence that they had found within 3 days from February 1st to February 4th to be able to confirm that it was not created in a lab?
As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, I was excluded from those conversations. And then to be excluded, I found unusual. I do think it illustrates one point that's worth really focusing on. When you have a group of people that decide there could only be one point of view, that's problematic. And I'll keep going saying it's antithetical to science. And unfortunately, that's what they did.
But here was this Stanford virality project worried about a very public hesitation. And, among other things they wrote that are on their website about this, they said, nowadays, the process of coming to an understanding happens in full view of the public. The back and forth and developmental nature of building this consensus can erode the public's confidence in scientific authority. We have scientists talking out in the open about their reasons for and against. It's confusing for people, and they're not going to do what we say. Since the beginning of the pandemic, medical researchers tried to understand COVID-19, even as a global public was anxiously demanding definitive answers on the best protection, treatments, and the possibility of vaccines. I seem to remember it a little bit more like a top-down shove-down, but again, I guess I don't have a right to see it the way I see it. Scientific consensus has shifted on the origin of the virus, the mechanism of transmission, and the efficacy of cures. Yet, when consensus is overturned, as new facts come to light that invalidate prior convictions, the tacit bond of trust between the scientific community and the public is challenged.
These companies can and do refuse service to law-abiding people and businesses whose only crime is falling afoul of a distant, faceless, unaccountable, algorithmic judge.
The limit of free speech historically has been incitement to violence or anarchy, the actual overthrow of a government. Anything other than that is historically covered by the First Amendment.
Yes. We're describing people having political arguments online.
That Twitter faced tremendous pressure to censor speech relating to elections, Hunter Biden, COVID, other topics. And this overwhelming pressure was coming from the federal government itself, from the FBI, from the Department of Homeland Security, from the State Department, from the CDC, and from the White House itself.
It's suffice to say that every bit of the speech, or virtually every bit of the speech, whether foreign or domestic, online, fell within the normal protections of the First Amendment, and the very act of federal dollars being used to stifle that speech is, in fact, historically what we would consider an indictment against the First Amendment protections.
Correct.
The pressure was also coming from an entire industry of think tanks, NGOs, fact-checking organizations, and academics whose work was, in many cases, supported by the federal government. They spent your tax dollars building infrastructure and information surveillance with the ultimate goal of silencing you.
So what they're beginning to suggest is that really the open information is the problem, and that basically the public probably shouldn't even see anything so complex that it would suggest something isn't true, or that they don't have it all figured out, or that a complete mandate or an authoritative policy might have some nuances. And so basically that should be figured out in secret, and the public should just be told what to do. And anyone who's raising questions about the gray area in between shouldn't be allowed to be heard, shouldn't be allowed to speak, I guess. The following scientific conversation, consumers of medical news needed to master scientific concepts. They had to have PhDs in immunity, RNA, and the methods including the trials of these vaccines. And lacking the tools to decipher the leading consensus among medical experts, evaluate the premises, and understand specific updates to fit among a wealth of challenging information, the public naturally became confused. The public are such children. Confusion fed fear.
And doing what Uncle Matt tells them. So now we're going to scare the pants off them by pretending this new variant is going to be even more lethal. Total lies. Absolute lies, people. This is hugely significant, a vast scandal, I think. But what we've seen is other journalists targeting their ire on Isabel Oakeshott.
Yeah, because you pointed out Julia Hartley-Brewer, I think, has written a piece in the Telegraph where she's basically said, in what world is Isabel Oakeshott this story? This story is about 100,000 messages that reveal that know her quite well. Yes. And, the BBC and others have completely lost their minds over this, probably because A, they were outscooped, and B, they weren't really...
To make matters worse, policies related to COVID-19 evolve with the latest scientific findings, occasionally requiring citizens to change their lifestyle and habits, sometimes within a few days' notice, and sometimes with the authoritative police state mechanism telling them that they basically have to, or they'll lose their way of life, or maybe their children, or... I mean, come on. For example, since February 2020, the UK closed and reopened schools twice, based partly on shifts in understanding of indoor transmission risks. This is nauseating to read. At the end of the day, what happened was they said the public can't handle this kind of nuance and confusion, so they knowingly censored true information. They knowingly took down facts. And they hid that information. They took it down. They wrote to people at Twitter and other social media platforms and had that content removed.
The chairman claimed that big government and big tech colluded to shape and mold the narrative and suppress information and censor Americans. This is a false narrative.
The Virality Project's research shows that this critical process of changes, updates, and reversals in scientific consensus can be misused to fuel hesitancy and engender distrust in medical experts. You gotta earn trust, and people have a right to discuss these things. It isn't right what happened. It offers a window for anti-vaccine activists and influencers to claim that experts and policymakers are incompetent. So let's skew information to make it seem like they're always competent and never wrong. Malicious.
A June 2021 report by the Virality Project warned Twitter that the release of Dr. Fauci's emails was being used to, quote, exacerbate distrust of Dr. Fauci and U.S. public health officials. That same report lamented that the emails were being, quote, interpreted to suggest that the coronavirus may have leaked from a lab.
They did conspire. Conspire just means work together. Technically, it means breathing together. There was a clear collaboration. There were orders sent. There were requests made to take down specific content and content generally that had certain keywords or certain elements to it. This happened. But they're saying they don't want to allow anyone to have that impression even as they're doing it. For example, Facebook announced it will no longer remove posts claiming that COVID-19 is man-made or manufactured. Senator Ted Cruz responded that it was now clear Facebook had been utilizing their monopoly position to censor on behalf of the government. I am not a big Ted Cruz fan, but from all we know, that's true. It's just true. I don't see how it's a partisan issue, but Debbie Wasserman Schultz sure seemed to think that it was a partisan issue. I didn't see it that way, but man.
Being a Republican witness today certainly casts a cloud over your objectivity. Now, you crossed that line with the Twitter files.
No.
Elon Musk, it's my time. Please do not interrupt me. Elon Musk spoon-fed you his cherry-picked information, which you must have suspected promotes a slanted viewpoint, or at the very least generates another right-wing conspiracy theory.
And so the Virality Project on their own website, they were worried about things like the back and forth and the developmental nature of building this consensus and how that can erode the public's confidence in scientific authority. So it's at the cost of the public's own expression and their ability to talk amongst each other and even to warn each other if there's something important enough to warn each other about. They discussed how policies related to COVID-19 evolved with the latest scientific findings, occasionally requiring citizens to change their lifestyles and habits. It wasn't occasional during that period. It was very deliberate, and it was really pushing the boundaries of society. I mean, why should people lose their rights in society because there's deemed an emergency that it later turns out we weren't even getting true facts about? I mean, come on. This is not even about the details of what was true and what wasn't. It's about the concept of not allowing truth to be known, even when they know it's true, because it doesn't help their own narrative, because it doesn't help the idea that this group, this conspiracy wants to put forward. I mean, I just encourage you to look at this yourself if you haven't.
Richard Stengel, you know who that is?
Yes, he's the former, the first head of the Global Engagement Center.
I want the American people to hear from him for 30 seconds.
Basically, every country creates their own narrative story. And you know, my old job at the State Department was what people used to joke as the chief propagandist job. We haven't talked about propaganda. Propaganda, I'm not against propaganda. Every country does it, and they have to do it to their own population.
Every country does it. Every country does propaganda, and they have to do it to their own people, is what Mr. Stengel said. If I understand correctly, he was the head of the Global Engagement Center at its creation, right?
He was, and in his book, Information Wars, there are a number of passages where he talks about creating a whole of government solution to the information problem. He hastened to say that he didn't want to create a quote, information ministry, but what he was describing roughly approximates that.
I mean, among other things, it emerged that Wikipedia, for instance, had 5,000 editors dedicated to tracking things during COVID-19 and 85 million edits. It's 85 million things they changed to maintain this narrative. I mean, it's an Orwellian story. It's a Humpty Dumpty, putting the pieces back together story. And it's just shameful. It is shameful.
And if books and newspapers and the radio are efficiently controlled, the people will read and accept exactly what the few in control want them to. In communities of this kind, despotism stands a good chance.
I had kind of thought that I would get into John Milton's Areopagitica. It was a speech and pamphlet that he published in 1644, right before the incident with Charles I and the Civil War in England. And I was going to find a passage, but it's written in that old language. I read it a couple of years back, and it's one of those really strong pro-First Amendment sentiment writings. Of course, it happened before the United States was formed and before the First Amendment was about the United States free speech. But this all formed in England and the growth of English civil liberties. It was a very big movement that I used to not know very much about. Now I've kind of studied it a little bit. I still have a lot to learn. But this was a time period where publishing was explicitly granted by royal charters, and they repealed that a little bit with the Habeas Corpus Act of 1640, abolishing at that time the Star Chamber, and this allowed censorship to be loosened, so publishing exploded at the time, and it went from a couple dozen publications and publishers to like more than 300. And so England at the time really had a sense of emergency about controlling perception and information. Sound familiar? And so the response was a 1643 licensing order that basically reinstituted pre-publication censorship. It was going to be basically things had to be reviewed and then approved to be published. Things had to be reviewed and approved to be said, to be printed, to reach people's ears. And clearly, by United States free speech standards, this was very wrong. If anything, it benefited the established powers and the status quo under the monarchy, which, by the way, historically was not lasting very much longer at this period. Very key period in English history. But the point is, John Milton testified before Parliament, much the way Matt Taibbi did, and he circulated his pamphlet Areopagitica, and though it's written in an old-timey language and therefore is a little bit more difficult to read, it has a very passionate plea based around the idea that restricting information itself is wrong and insulting to the intelligence of a person, and that if people are meant to have discernment and meant to be morally good and upright, that they should be educated. They should know what they're talking about. And therefore, you have to know about things that are not squeaky clean under a moral or religious view. You have to know about all things, or at least have the ability to encounter all types of literature. And if you, as an individual, encounter literature that is offensive or shameful or heretical, that you, as an individual, by growing stronger in your own faith and your own system of morals, would have the ability to see it for what it is and reject it. People need to be and should be, and frankly are, strong enough to encounter information for themselves and have discernment about it and reject or accept those ideas of their own volition. And if they're not, we're just all children. And if that information is so licentious, if that information is so offensive and heretical that ordinary people can't see it, how are the censors, how are they good enough to see that information? I mean, if you open a book and it's like the funniest joke in the world that kills you on the spot, or if you open a book and the evils on that page convert you to a devil worshiper immediately, how can the censors review that information to know that they need to restrict it from people? See what I'm saying? They have to have discernment, but what makes them better than other people? Are they more qualified really to encounter that information and not be tainted by it, but other people in society cannot decide for themselves if that information is good, if it has a value or not?
And if books and newspapers and the radio are efficiently controlled, the people will read and accept exactly what the few in control want them to.
You know, part of Milton's argument advances the idea that you kind of have to know what the ills of society are in order to reject them and in order to steer clear of them and in order to learn lessons to make you stronger against those sort of devices in life. Okay? If you didn't know the devil existed and if you knew nothing of the devil's traps and tricks, how could you avoid them? Right? You have to be warned about them at some level. And it can't be through a complete blackout because that type of censorship, making a complete taboo on the thing you're against, basically just makes people curious about it. And it also makes them ignorant and childlike, which is the very thing they accuse people of being like, that they would need to censor the narrative, that they would need to control the narrative just to tell people what to do, but that people couldn't handle complex truths.
The Twitter files, state attorneys general lawsuits, and investigative reporters have revealed a large and growing network of government agencies, academic institutions, and non-governmental organizations that are actively censoring American citizens, often without their knowledge, on a range of issues. Government-funded censors frequently invoke the prevention of real-world harm to justify their demands for censorship, but the censors define harm far more expansively than the Supreme Court does. Increasingly, the censors say their goal is to restrict information that delegitimizes governmental, industrial, and news media organizations. That mandate is so sweeping.
And Milton makes a really good point right here, one that you might not have considered, that orders to suppress materials that are scandalous, seditious, and libelous basically don't work because that very type of material is intended to be suppressed. It's literally people trolling you. It's an agitation. They don't get their feelings hurt when it gets suppressed and shut down. It's kind of what they were going for. No? You think about the parallels to today's narrative. What is true misinformation? It's some BS that's being posted just to clog up the pipeline. It's not true information. No one's holding on to that or fastidiously trying to make sure that the world knows it. It's false. It's just junk. To create a scandal, what you really want is the reaction. When they banned the book a few weeks later, that's kind of what one would want. What is actually happening by the suppressing of supposedly that material is that you're actually discouraging learning, you're stopping the truth, you're really just suppressing people's ability to learn the difference and go through the training of recognizing true information, better information, more valuable things to discuss, right? Scandalous, seditious, libelous disinformation, that's the kind of stuff that is meant to cause reactions. It's meant to push people's buttons. It's meant to burn out fast, in other words. As for everything else, I guess it just goes by the wayside.
In China, censors have reportedly been ordered to flood social media with harmless posts about Xinjiang, which is under lockdown for more than a month. This is done to control mounting complaints of food and medical shortages.
It's some BS that's being posted just to clog up the pipeline. It's not true information.
Censors were told to open a campaign of comment flooding to drown them out. Now, according to the report, content may include domestic life, daily parenting, cooking, or personal moves.
Do you see how history is repeating itself here? This was England 100 plus years before the American Revolution. And yet, to me, it sounds like exactly what is happening in the environment online today. It's as if we as a people have learned nothing. They act like anything that could persuade people to support a right-wing candidate or a far left-wing candidate or a foreign power just shouldn't be known to them. But if it's such a good point, why wouldn't it be persuasive? But if that foreign power or that political extreme is so detestable, don't you think people would figure that out for themselves? Why would people want to support their own demise? You see what I'm saying? You can't have a society that was taught to read, taught to become literate, and then tell them you can't see anything that isn't within the bowling bumper lane. We have to make it such that when you roll the ball, you always just hit the pins. You can never go out of bounds. Society cannot operate in a way that its citizens are supposed to be so childish and ignorant and simple that encountering information that goes against the official narrative or goes against their own values would spoil the whole thing. If that's where we're at, then we're in really deep trouble, okay? And we are in trouble. But the idea that there's going to be minders, people who they know better, but you can't know better, it's ridiculous, okay? The people who are operating this mechanism, they're not specialized in understanding what's right here. They're just working on behalf of a partisan issue. They're working on behalf of an agenda. People don't like when you say, oh, there's an agenda. This is people working to uphold the narrative of an agenda. These aren't people who are enlightened because they've studied for so many years and understood the ins and outs of complex logical arguments and have this wisdom, okay? There have been societies based around the wisdom of the elders, and they had their good and bad points too. That's not what this is, though. This isn't based on an authority derived from a meritocracy. It's not an authority derived from wisdom. This is just minders telling you that you're not allowed to say certain things because you're not supposed to know certain things because those things would be inconvenient. And it's just wrong. It's just wrong. Read it for yourself. It's not particularly long. It's just old-timey language. But Milton scores some pretty good points there, and I think they're points that are still valid today. You know, it doesn't stand on solid ground, this whole idea of censorship. Even the worst things should be allowed to be said and printed, because good people are never going to fall for those things. Good people are going to know better, and they should be strong enough in their own knowledge and wisdom and personal growth to reject the bad things, whatever those might be. Instead, what's happened here has not only knowingly shut down people who speak the truth at great consequence to their lives and their well-being and their livelihoods, but it's just systematically evil because it is rejecting the truth for the false truth that is being propped up to serve an agenda. I don't know how else to say it. I'm appalled by this. And as much as I knew this was going on, I didn't know specifically what and specifically who was involved. I could tell it was going on, though. It's still kind of shocking. It is shocking, and it's shocking that it can come out and that the public is so conditioned to this hyper-polarized atmosphere that so many people could see this truth and still say, it's false, that's a lie, that's not what's going on. That's just someone's partisan, scaremongering and whatever. I think everyone hearing my voice already knows anyway. I just don't know what to do. I'm just appalled. All right, got more stuff on the way that we've been crafting more carefully, but it's just a reaction video, so for what it's worth.
The censorship industrial complex combines established methods of psychological manipulation, some developed by the U.S. military during the global war on terror, with highly sophisticated tools from computer science, including artificial intelligence. The complex's leaders are driven by the fear that the internet and social media platforms empower populist, alternative, and fringe personalities and views which they regard as destabilizing. Importantly, the bar for bringing in military-grade government monitoring and speech countering techniques has moved from, quote, countering terrorism to, quote, countering extremism to countering simple misinformation, otherwise known as being wrong on the internet. I've never worked on an issue where so frequently while doing it, I just had chills go up my spine because of what I was seeing happening. I never thought in my own country that freedom of speech would be threatened in this way. And it's just frightening when you get into it.
Because it is a bedrock principle of our constitutional system that the government does not get to decide what speech is acceptable or true. Under the First Amendment, Americans have a right to speak freely, regardless of whether their speech upsets the preferred narrative. In fact, that's when it needs the most vigorous protection.
The First Amendment and an American population accustomed to the right to speak is the best defense left against the censorship industrial complex. If the latter can knock over our first and most important constitutional guarantee, these groups will have no serious opponent left anywhere. If there's anything the Twitter files show, it's that we're in danger of losing this most precious right, without which all democratic rights are impossible.